This is our energy flow in the ecosystems guided notes. This is going to be part 1 of 3. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing we're going to talk about are energy roles. Now, energy roles are determined by how an organism obtains energy. Okay, so an organism's energy role is determined by how it obtains energy and how it interacts with other organisms. Each organism in an ecosystem fills the energy role of either a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer. Every organism has to be one of these things, either a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer. And we know now, if you count, there's 3 types of energy roles, and we'll talk about each type of energy role in more detail. So let's talk about producers to start. So an organism that makes its own food is a producer. It's easy to remember what producer does because it's in its name. It produces its own food. So examples of producers would include plants, algae, and some bacteria. Okay, so not all bacteria are able to perform photosynthesis to make their own food, but some bacteria are able to do that. Let's take a look at what algae would look like. Maybe you've heard that word before, but you're not quite sure what that looks like. So we take a look at algae. You see that if you looked at a pond or a lake and it has this green film around the edges, then that's going to be algae. And what does it look like under a microscope? Where you see down below the picture that has algae under a microscope, so that way you can actually know what it looks like up close. And then bacteria, where you can't really see bacteria with your naked eye. That means without assistance from a microscope. So here's what bacteria looks like under a microscope. Now, all of those things, plants, algae, and bacteria, some bacteria, are examples of producers that would make their own food. So how does an oak tree, for example, then produce its own energy? How does photosynthesis work? Well, let's review, because you probably learned this in 6th grade, but you need to probably brush up on it just a little bit. Well, you have solar energy that enters your ecosystem as sunlight. Okay, because when you hear the word solar, you want to think of sun. So we know that solar energy that's entering the ecosystem. Now, producers capture the energy of sunlight and store it as food energy. These organisms use the sun's energy to then turn water, so H2O is water, and carbon dioxide into food molecules in a process called photosynthesis. Okay. Now, producers are the source of all food in an ecosystem. So even if you think, well, I don't just eat plants, well, you need to think about where your food comes from and what your food might have eaten. So it could grow so you could eat it. So let's think about pizza. If you have pizza for lunch, you might not think right away that that's a producer, but if you looked at your pizza and thought about it, let's take a look at pepperoni. So your pepperoni is going to come from probably a pig, and a pig would eat many things. One of them might be a wheat or corn, and those things are plants, and plants are a producer. You have cheese on your pizza, and cheese comes from milk that could come from goats or from cows. And goats and cows would eat grass, they would eat hay, they would eat corn, they would eat wheat. So all of those things are examples of plants, which are producers. Your tomato sauce comes from tomatoes. A tomato is a plant, which is a producer. And the crust of your pizza is made of wheat. And your wheat is a plant, which is also a producer. So if you think back to anything that you're eating, it's all going to be traced back to a producer. So producers are the source of all food in the ecosystem. So if we didn't have sun that is coming into our ecosystem to bring that energy source in so producers could make their own food, then nobody would be able to live. No animals, no humans, nothing would be able to survive without that sunlight. Okay, so let's move on to the next section, talk about our second energy role, which is consumers. Okay, an organism that obtains energy by feeding on other organisms is called a consumer. So consumers are classified by what they eat. And there are three categories of consumers. The first one we're going to talk about are herbivores. Okay, so these are consumers that only eat plants. If you look at the name herbivore, it has herb in it. And herb could be like basil or thyme or mint, something that you can grow in a garden and use in your cooking. That's a plant. So if you know what an herb is, herbivore makes a lot of sense that they're plant eaters. Some examples might be deer or caterpillar. Okay, even cows could be examples of herbivores. The next type of consumer we want to talk about is a carnivore. And these are consumers that eat only animals. And examples include lions and spiders. You may also think of sharks as a big carnivore. Okay, and the last type of consumer is an omnivore. Omni means all. So that's going to help you know that these are consumers that eat everything. Okay, they eat both plants and animals. So examples include crows, bears, they eat berries and fish, and most humans are also omnivores. Some humans prefer not to eat animals, but most humans are omnivores. One of the last things we'll need to talk about when we talk about consumers is a scavenger. Now, a scavenger, that's a subtype of carnivore. So these are carnivores that feed on the bodies of dead animals. So examples would include like a vulture and even catfish. So out to the side right that this is a subtype of carnivore. Okay, so carnivores we know eat animals, but this is a special type of carnivore because they don't just eat any kind of animal, they have to eat dead animals only. So that's why that's considered a subtype of carnivore. Okay. And our last energy role is decomposers. Okay, and decomposers break down wastes and dead organisms and then return the raw materials to the ecosystem. So decomposers break down wastes and dead organisms and then return the raw materials back to the ecosystem. Now, decomposers are different than scavengers because the decomposers are breaking down not just dead animals, but it could be plant matter as well. Like maybe it is a tree limb that broke off during a storm or an old stump. And if it's rotting, well, it probably has decomposers that are helping it do that. So it could be plant and animal organisms that are dead that it's helping to break down. And it's not necessarily eating it like a scavenger would. Some decomposers are using chemicals that they secrete to break those dead organisms and waste down so they can return back to the soil. So why are these decomposers so important? Well, without decomposers, the raw materials of life would stay locked up in waste in the bodies of dead organisms. So decomposers can really be thought of as nature's recyclers. So if you've watched The Lion King, and I'm sure a lot of you have watched The Lion King, they have a song in there called The Circle of Life. And The Circle of Life, and when you're watching that movie, is talking about how the lions eat antelope and the antelope eat the grass. But when the lions die, well, what happens to them? Well, they'll have to break down and return to the earth and to the soil, and that helps the soil become more fertile so that grass can grow even better. And then what eats the grass? Well, the antelopes eat the grass, and then what will eat the antelope again? Well, the lions. So it's a continuous cycle and a circle, and that's what they're talking about when they say a circle of life in that song. And without the decomposers, there's not a circle. So that's a very important part. So this is the end of part 1. You can rewind anything that you need to go back and listen to again, but we're going to stop here and then we'll start again with a second part talking more about food webs and food chains. Thank you for listening.